In Nigeria, Christians are being targeted, driven from their homes, and killed. Churches have been burned. Families have been torn apart, and entire communities live in fear constantly, simply because of how they pray.
In the carefully curated world of celebrity social media, where follower counts represent currency more valuable than actual money, where maintaining pristine public image requires avoiding controversial topics that might alienate segments of your fan base, and where the unwritten rule has been that entertainers should entertain rather than educate or advocate on issues that progressive gatekeepers deem problematic, Nicki Minaj has done something quite extraordinary that has cost her over 1 million Instagram followers and counting. The Anaconda rapper spoke at the United Nations about Nigerian Christian killings, advocating for victims of religious persecution in Africa, and the backlash has been swift and brutal, as her follower count plummets from 224 million to 223 million and continues declining.
Credit for speaking out. I hope she continues to do it. I hope she inspires others to speak out. But it's a really sad day when it takes, a Hollywood rapper to speak out, to bring light to something when, there's a whole foreign policy establishment at the United Nations that exists.
According to Signal principal and pollster Nick Weinstein, Minaj losing Instagram followers after speaking at the UN is indicative of what we see on the left, explaining that for some reason, the left has decided there is virtue in weakness, and because they perceive that Christians are the majority in the Western world, they cannot perceive Christians in Africa could potentially be the victims of their circumstance. But whilst the Barbs and the Beehive engage in social media warfare, and whilst Nicki's follower count suffers, the question becomes whether speaking truth about religious persecution matters more than maintaining Instagram metrics. Welcome to Celebrity Gossip, where we expose the truth about how Nicki Minaj has been ranting to her 28 million Twitter followers for days, tweeting back-to-back and coming from multiple celebrities, including even Beyoncé and Jay-Z, and how the Beehive being debatably more loyal than the Barbs means that Nicki's follower counts have suffered as a result. Subscribe now for daily analysis that refuses to accept that celebrities should remain silent about religious persecution to protect their follower counts, and that asks whether losing 1 million Instagram followers is price worth paying to speak at United Nations about Nigerian Christian killings, whilst progressive left decides there is no virtue in defending Christian victims because Christians are perceived as majority in Western world. The timeline of Nicki's follower collapse deserves careful examination because it reveals how quickly and how dramatically social media metrics can shift when celebrities touch topics that progressive audiences find uncomfortable. According to Red Media, the Trinidadian rapstress originally had 224 million followers over on Instagram before September 30th when the beef began. She now has 223 million, and the count is still declining as fans are not best pleased with some of the comments she has made. This represents loss of over 1 million followers in a matter of weeks, which, for celebrity of Nicki's stature, represents significant erosion of social media presence, and therefore of cultural influence and commercial value. But the reason for this follower exodus is what makes this story significant beyond typical celebrity drama. Nicki did not lose followers because of scandal involving her personal life, because of failed album release, or because of some trivial social media controversy. She lost followers because she spoke at United Nations about Nigerian Christian killings, because she advocated for victims of religious persecution in Africa, and because she refused to accept progressive orthodoxy that Christians can only be oppressors rather than victims, regardless of circumstances. This is celebrity using platform to draw attention to humanitarian crisis and being punished for it by an audience that apparently prefers their entertainers to avoid uncomfortable truths about religious violence in developing world. Weinstein's analysis that Nicki losing followers is indicative of what we see on the left, cuts to heart of the ideological framework that makes Christian persecution in Africa a topic that progressive audiences find difficult to acknowledge. His observation that, for some reason, the left has decided there is virtue in weakness identifies a fundamental shift in progressive ideology where victim status is assigned based on identity categories rather than on actual circumstances. In this framework, Christians are categorized as powerful majority regardless of where they live or what they experience, which makes it ideologically impossible to recognize them as victims even when they are being killed for their faith. The specific formulation that, because they perceive that Christians are the majority in the Western world, they cannot perceive Christians in Africa could potentially be the victims of their circumstance, reveals the intellectual dishonesty at the core of this position. Christians may indeed be majority in many Western countries, though even this is increasingly debatable as secularization advances and as demographic changes occur. But the relevant question when discussing Nigerian Christian killings is not what percentage of the population Christians represent in Western countries. The relevant question is whether Christians in Nigeria are being targeted and killed because of their faith, which is a documented fact that should concern anyone who claims to care about human rights and religious freedom, regardless of ideological commitments about which groups are allowed to be recognized as victims. The reality of Christian persecution in Nigeria is well documented by human rights organizations, by United Nations agencies, and by countless eyewitness testimonies from survivors and from communities affected by violence. Boko Haram and other extremist groups have conducted systematic campaigns against Christian communities, burning churches, massacring congregants, kidnapping schoolgirls from Christian schools, and forcing conversions at gunpoint. These are not isolated incidents. These are organized campaigns of religious persecution and ethnic cleansing that have killed thousands and displaced millions. The fact that progressive audiences are uncomfortable acknowledging this reality because victims are Christians reveals a profound moral bankruptcy where ideological commitments override basic human decency. Weinstein's hope that Nicki inspires others to speak out represents a recognition that celebrity advocacy on this issue could break through progressive reluctance to acknowledge Christian persecution. Celebrities have enormous platforms and influence. When they choose to use those platforms to draw attention to humanitarian crises, they can shift public discourse and create pressure for policy responses. But celebrities are also extraordinarily risk-averse about touching topics that might alienate portions of their fan base, or that might expose them to accusations of being on the wrong side of progressive orthodoxy. Nicki's willingness to speak at United Nations about this issue, despite knowing it would be controversial, represents courage that is rare in entertainment industry, where maintaining broad appeal typically requires avoiding anything controversial.
But the backlash Nicki is experiencing goes beyond the United Nations speech to include her broader social media behavior that has alienated fans and that has brought her into conflict with other fandoms. The fact that Nicki has been ranting to her 28 million Twitter followers for days, tweeting back-to-back, and coming from multiple celebrities, including even Beyoncé and Jay-Z, suggests that the follower exodus is not solely about the Christian persecution speech, but is also about a broader pattern of behavior that fans find off-putting. When you come for Beyoncé and Jay-Z, you are declaring war on the Beehive. And the Beehive is debatably more loyal than the Barbs, which means that Nicki cannot win that fight in terms of social media metrics. The observation that the Beehive is debatably more loyal than the Barbs is significant because it reveals the power dynamics within celebrity fandom culture. The Beehive has a reputation as most organized, most committed, and most ruthless fandom in entertainment, willing to engage in coordinated attacks against anyone perceived as disrespecting Beyoncé. The Barbs, whilst certainly devoted to Nicki, may not have the same level of organization or the same willingness to engage in sustained social media warfare on behalf of their queen. This means that when conflict erupts between these fandoms, Nicki is at disadvantage regardless of the merits of any specific dispute, which translates into follower losses as Beehive members who may have followed Nicki unfollow her, whilst Barb's members are less effective at coordinating a counter-response. But separating the legitimate criticism of Nicki's social media behavior from the backlash against her United Nations speech about Christian persecution is important, because conflating these issues obscures the fundamental question about whether celebrities should face consequences for advocating on humanitarian issues. If Nicki is losing followers primarily because she went after Beyoncé and Jay-Z in ways that fans found inappropriate or delusional, that is straightforward fandom dynamics playing out. But if substantial portion of follower loss stems from her United Nations speech about Nigerian Christian killings, that represents something more troubling about progressive audiences being unwilling to acknowledge religious persecution when victims belong to wrong identity category. The declining follower count, still dropping as fans continue unfollowing, suggests that the backlash is not merely temporary reaction that will stabilize once the controversy passes. This appears to be a sustained exodus of followers who have made calculation that they no longer want to follow Nicki, either because of her comments about Beyoncé and Jay-Z, or because of her United Nations speech, or because of broader pattern of behavior that they find problematic. For a celebrity whose brand and influence depend heavily on social media presence, this sustained decline represents a real threat to career and to earning potential because brands and collaborators look at follower counts when determining who to work with and how much to pay. The specific dynamics of why fans are not best pleased with some of the comments she has made requires unpacking, because it reveals what behaviors are considered acceptable versus unacceptable within celebrity culture. Coming for other celebrities, particularly beloved figures like Beyoncé and Jay-Z, is high-risk behavior that can alienate fans who admire those targets. Engaging in sustained social media rants that make you appear unhinged or desperate for attention can damage carefully cultivated image of confidence and success. And speaking about controversial political or religious topics, particularly when those topics involve defending Christians against persecution, can alienate progressive fans who view such advocacy as problematic, regardless of underlying facts about violence or persecution they are experiencing. The intersection of these different factors, the United Nations speech about Christian persecution, the social media warfare with other celebrities, the sustained ranting on Twitter, creates a complex picture where multiple audiences are upset for multiple reasons. Some fans are upset about the Beyoncé and Jay-Z comments. Some fans are upset about what they perceive as erratic social media behavior. And some fans are upset about the Christian persecution speech because it conflicts with their ideological framework about which groups can be recognized as victims. The resulting follower loss represents the aggregate of all these different sources of discontent, which makes it difficult to determine precisely how much of the decline stems from each specific factor. But Nick Weinstein's focus on the Christian persecution speech as indicative of what we see on the left suggests that this aspect of the backlash is particularly significant because it reveals ideological rigidity that prevents acknowledging humanitarian crises when victims belong to wrong identity category. This is not merely about Nicki Minaj losing Instagram followers. This is about broader pattern where progressive activism and progressive audiences have decided that certain groups can never be victims regardless of circumstances, and that advocating for those groups makes you suspect regardless of facts about violence or persecution they are experiencing. The formulation that the left has decided there is virtue and weakness deserves further examination because it captures something important about contemporary progressive ideology. Traditional progressive concern for the vulnerable and for the oppressed has been replaced by an ideological framework where victim status is assigned based on identity categories determined by prevailing theories about power and oppression. In this framework, Christians are categorized as powerful oppressors in Western context, and this categorization is then applied globally regardless of local circumstances. Nigerian Christians being killed by extremist groups should be recognized as victims deserving advocacy and protection. But progressive ideology makes this recognition difficult because Christians belong to wrong identity category within Western context. Nicki Minaj losing over 1 million Instagram followers after speaking at the United Nations about Nigerian Christian killings represents a collision between humanitarian advocacy and ideological rigidity, where progressive audiences cannot acknowledge Christian persecution because Christians belong to wrong victim category. Nick Weinstein's focus on the Christian persecution speech as indicative of what we see on the left suggests that this aspect of the backlash is particularly significant because it reveals ideological rigidity that prevents acknowledging humanitarian crises when victims belong to wrong categories. This is not merely about Nicki Minaj losing Instagram followers. This is about broader pattern where progressive activism and progressive audiences have decided that certain groups can never be victims regardless of circumstances, and that advocating for those groups makes you suspect regardless of facts about violence or persecution they are experiencing.